Clara Ashwood had practiced keeping her eyes down for 7 years, and she nearly forgot the habit the moment she stepped through the castle's servant entrance and smelled wood smoke and beeswax polish. The exact scent of a home, she'd told herself. For 7 years, she'd stopped grieving. Name? The housekeeper. A broad, no-nonsense woman named Greta. Barely looked up from her ledger. Mara, Clara said. The lie came easily now. She'd had 7 years of practice. Mara. Kitchen and upper floor linens, to start. You'll be tested on the silver before you're trusted anywhere near it. Greta finally glanced up, taking in Clara's plain gray dress, her carefully unremarkable braid, the calluses on her hands that told a story considerably rougher than any noble upbringing. You've done this work before. I have, Clara said, which was true, if you counted 7 years of scrubbing other people's floors under other people's names. She was assigned quarters in the servants' wing that same afternoon, and spent her first evening walking the castle's lower corridors with her heart hammering against every familiar turn. The kitchen stairwell she'd once raced down as a girl of 19, laughing, the very night before the fire that had supposedly killed her family and, according to the story the entire kingdom believed, killed her too. She had not come back for nostalgia. She had come back because 7 years of hiding had taught her exactly one thing worth risking everything for. The fire hadn't been an accident. Her father hadn't simply lost a political gamble. And somewhere inside these walls, buried in records nobody thought to guard against a dead woman, sat the proof that would finally let her stop running. She did not expect to see him at all, not really. Kings didn't often cross paths with kitchen maids, and she planned her entire disguise around exactly that distance. She saw him on the 3rd evening, delivering a tray to the smaller dining hall where the Alpha King preferred to take meals when the full court's formal theater wasn't strictly required, and made the mistake, just once, just for a single unguarded second, of lifting her eyes as she set the tray down. Alpha King Rowan Ashgrove went utterly still. "Leave us," he said, to the 2 guards flanking the doorway, his voice carrying a controlled, absolute authority Clara remembered with a jolt that went straight through her chest. The guards left. Clara stood frozen beside the table, understanding, with dawning horror, that she had just made the single worst mistake of a 7-year disguise in the space of one careless glance. Clara. Her name, spoken for the first time in 7 years by the one voice she'd never once managed to fully forget, landed like a physical blow. You're supposed to be dead. The kingdom of Ashgrove had spent 7 years believing the Voss family's downfall was a simple, if tragic, matter of failed politics. Lord Corwin Voss, once a respected advisor within the royal council, accused of embezzling considerable funds from the crown's treasury, his family estate burned in what the official record described as a candle left unattended. His wife and daughter presumed to have died alongside him in the resulting blaze. Rowan Ashgrove had been 26 years old at the time, 3 years into his reign, and had loved Clara Voss with the particular, uncomplicated intensity of a young man who had found his true mate at 19 and never once doubted, in the 2 years that followed, that they would spend the rest of their lives together. He had been away from the capital the night of the fire, inspecting border defenses in response to a threat his council had insisted required his personal attention, a threat that had turned out, upon later and considerably more careful investigation he'd never actually conducted, to be entirely fabricated. He had returned to find Clara's family estate reduced to smoking ruin, 3 bodies recovered from the wreckage too badly burned for certain identification, and a grieving council that had, with remarkable speed and remarkable unanimity, assured him the tragedy was exactly what it appeared to be. He had mourned her for 7 years. He had never remarried, had rebuffed every careful political suggestion his council continued to offer, had built a reputation across those 7 years as a king whose competence in matters of state stood in stark, well-known contrast to the particular coldness he brought to anything resembling his own personal life. What he did not know, what nobody in Ashgrove's court, save one man, knew, was that Clara Voss had survived the fire entirely by accident, thrown clear by a servant's desperate intervention moments before the estate's east wing collapsed, and had spent that first devastating night hidden in the estate's old grain cellar, listening through the floorboards to voices she recognized, with growing horror, as belonging to men who worked directly for the crown. She had heard enough, that night, to understand two things with absolute, life-altering clarity: that her father's supposed embezzlement had been fabricated, planted evidence designed to justify his removal from the council, and that the fire had not been an accident at all, but a deliberate execution, ordered by someone within Rowan's own trusted circle, someone with enough authority to fabricate financial records, enough resources to orchestrate an assassination disguised as tragedy, and enough patience to have planned it, apparently, for months. She had fled that same night, understanding that surviving meant disappearing completely. No message to Rowan, no plea for help, nothing that might reach the ears of whoever had ordered her family's death and confirm that a witness remained alive. She had spent 7 years moving between minor territories under a succession of false names, working whatever honest labor she could find, watching every shadow, trusting no one, gathering, in the careful, patient corners of her own private investigation, exactly the evidence she would need before she ever dared return. She had returned now because the evidence, finally, pointed somewhere specific, a name whispered once, 7 years earlier, through those grain cellar floorboards, that she had spent considerable years confirming through careful, indirect inquiry. Lord Howrick Venn, Rowan's own chief council advisor, a man who had served the crown for over 2 decades and had, in the years since Clara's supposed death, quietly consolidated more genuine political power than anyone else in Ashgrove's court. She had not planned on Rowan recognizing her. She had planned her disguise with meticulous care, understanding that a king's attention rarely settled long on kitchen staff, that 7 years had changed her face enough, thinner, harder, the softness of 19 worn entirely away, that even old portraits might not immediately give her away. She had not accounted for the particular, permanent way a true mate bond apparently refused to forget a face, however thoroughly the rest of the world had been convinced to. "You're mistaken, Your Majesty." Clara kept her voice level, her eyes fixed carefully on the tray she'd just set down, understanding that whatever composure she'd carried through the door had already, catastrophically, failed her once, and that the only path forward now required considerably more discipline than the single unguarded glance that had ended it. "I'm not mistaken." Rowan rose from his chair, and Clara felt him cross the small distance between them with the particular, controlled restraint of a man forcing himself not to move faster than the moment could bear. "I would know your face in 1,000 rooms, in 1,000 disguises. Clara, look at me properly." "My name is Mara," Clara said, forcing herself to finally lift her eyes, understanding the lie needed her full, steady conviction now or not at all. "I'm a maid, Your Majesty. I don't know who you're thinking of." Something in Rowan's expression, hope, and beneath it, a devastating, 7-year-old grief suddenly reignited, cracked at the flatness of her denial, though his gaze never once wavered from her face. "You have a scar," he said quietly, "just above your left eyebrow, from falling out of the stable loft when you were 14. I remember you telling me about it, laughing, the first week we met, because you said it was the only thing that kept you from being considered properly noble enough for anyone's serious courtship." Clara felt her carefully maintained composure threaten to shatter entirely, the specific, intimate memory landing with a force she hadn't properly braced herself against. "Coincidences happen," she said, though her voice came out considerably less steady than a moment before. "Not this many," Rowan said. Clara, please. 7 years. I buried an empty coffin for you. I need to understand what happened. Why you're standing in my dining hall wearing a maid's uniform and telling me you're a stranger. Clara understood. In that single, suspended moment, that continuing the denial would only deepen whatever suspicion had already, irreversibly taken root, that her single best remaining option was not further lying, but careful, controlled truth, offered on terms she could still manage. If I were this woman you believe you recognize, she said slowly, and if she'd survived something considerable enough to require 7 years of hiding, what would make you believe telling you the truth wouldn't simply put her back in exactly the danger she'd spent all those years avoiding? Rowan went very still, understanding assembling itself across his features with growing, devastating clarity. You're alive, he said, because someone tried to kill you. And you've spent 7 years hiding, because whoever did it never faced any consequences. I never said that, Clara said, though the careful non-denial confirmed considerably more than she'd intended. You didn't need to, Rowan said, something fierce and immediate entering his voice. Clara, whatever name you're using, whatever you need me to call you in front of others, I need you to understand that I will move every resource this crown commands to protect you the moment you tell me the truth. Clara studied him for a long, careful moment, 7 years of hard-won caution warring against a genuine, aching relief she hadn't expected to feel this immediately, standing in front of the one person in the entire kingdom who had apparently never once, in 7 years, stopped believing she mattered enough to remember properly. I need considerably more than a single dinner's promise before I trust that, she said finally. I don't yet know who inside this castle is safe to trust, Your Majesty. That includes you, however genuine your recognition seems tonight. Fair, Rowan said, though something in his voice carried a raw, difficult ache.
What do you need from me, then?
Beyond trust one haven't yet earned back. Silence, Clara said.
For now.
Let me remain Mara, exactly as I planned. Don't summon guards, don't investigate my papers, don't do anything that draws attention to a maid you had a strange private conversation with. I need time, considerable time, before I'm ready to explain everything I actually know. Rowan was quiet a long moment, old grief and fresh, careful hope warring visibly behind his controlled composure. I'll give you that, he said finally. Silence and whatever time you need. But Clara, I need you to understand. I'm not simply going to forget what I just learned and continue ruling this kingdom as though you're still dead. I intend to find out exactly what happened to you, with or without your cooperation. I genuinely prefer with it. Then give me a few days, Clara said, to decide how much I'm actually ready to trust you with. She left the small dining hall with her heart still hammering, understanding, with growing unease, exactly how thoroughly her carefully planned 7-year discipline had already, in a single unguarded glance, begun to unravel. Rowan spent the following 3 days in a state of controlled, private turmoil his counsel mistook, entirely, for the usual weight of governance, canceling 2 minor audiences without explanation, staring for considerable stretches at the small portrait he still kept, unframed, in a locked drawer of his private desk, a young woman's laughing face he had spent 7 years unable to either display properly or fully put away. He said nothing to anyone. He understood, with the same careful, disciplined instinct that had kept his throne stable through 7 years of grief he'd never fully processed, that whatever Clara had survived required considerably more caution than his own overwhelming relief was currently prepared to properly manage. He watched her, instead, carefully from a distance, understanding that direct pursuit would only confirm the suspicion he was still managing to keep contained. He noted over those 3 days the particular efficiency with which she moved through the castle's servant corridors, the way her eyes tracked exits and entrances with a wariness that suggested years of practice, necessary caution rather than simple new hire nervousness. He noted, too, the evenings she spent, according to Greta's careful, unwitting mention of a maid working unusually late hours in the castle's lower archive levels, ostensibly cataloging old linens that hadn't required cataloging in considerable time. On the fourth evening, he found her there, the archives dusty, candlelit corridors considerably less traveled than the rest of the castle's evening bustle, Clara seated at a small desk surrounded by ledgers Rowan recognized, with dawning understanding, as belonging to the Treasury's records from 7 years earlier. "You're investigating my father's supposed embezzlement," he said, from the doorway, watching her go rigid at the sound of his voice. "Your Majesty," she said, rising quickly. "I can explain." "You don't need to explain," Rowan said, crossing into the small archive room with careful, deliberate steps. "I understand exactly what you're looking for, Clara. I'd like to help if you'll allow it." Clara studied him for a long moment, 7 years of hard-won caution warring visibly against genuine, careful consideration. "These records were falsified," she said finally, gesturing at the ledger open before her. "I've spent 3 evenings comparing them against my father's own private financial records, which I managed to preserve before I fled. The numbers don't match, Your Majesty. Not by small margins that might reflect honest accounting differences. By considerable amounts, deliberately fabricated." "You've had access to your father's private records for 7 years?" Rowan asked, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "I kept a single strongbox," Clara said, "buried, before the fire, in the estate's old orchard. I retrieved it 3 years ago, once I felt confident enough that whoever wanted me dead had genuinely stopped actively searching." "Show me," Rowan said. Clara hesitated, 7 years of careful, protective instinct warring against a genuine, cautious hope that his offered assistance might actually prove trustworthy. "If I show you," she said slowly, "and it leads somewhere you don't expect, somewhere inside your own trusted circle, will you actually act on it? Or will 7 years of loyalty to whoever it turns out to be make that considerably harder than you're currently imagining?" Rowan's expression hardened, something absolute and unwavering entering his voice. "I buried an empty coffin for a woman I loved, Clara, because someone I trusted convinced me the fire was a tragic accident. Whoever actually caused that, I don't care how long they've served this crown, or how deeply I once trusted them. They will face genuine consequences, regardless of the cost." Clara studied him a moment longer, understanding, with growing, careful relief, that the conviction in his voice carried considerably more weight than simple, easy reassurance. "Then I'll show you," she said finally, reaching for a small, worn leather case she'd kept tucked beneath the archive desk. "But Your Majesty, once you see this, there's no undoing what it means. I've spent 3 years confirming exactly one name through careful, indirect inquiry. I need you to be genuinely prepared for whatever comes next, before I say it aloud." "I've had 7 years to prepare for this conversation," Rowan said quietly. "I don't think any additional warning is going to change that readiness now." Clara spread her father's private ledgers across the small archive desk with careful, practiced precision, 7 years of meticulous, patient investigation finally, cautiously shared with someone beyond her own solitary vigilance. "Here," she said, pointing to a specific entry, "is my father's own record of the Treasury allocation for the Northern Border Fortification Project, dated 3 months before the fire. 4,000 crowns, disbursed properly, documented with his own hand and the Council's formal approval." She pulled the Treasury's official record beside it. "And here is the Crown's own record of that same allocation. 6,000 crowns. 2,000 crowns difference, attributed, in the official record, to my father's personal account, with no corroborating documentation beyond a single signature that isn't actually his." Rowan studied the discrepancy with growing, controlled fury. This is the exact embezzlement charge that ended his council position. It's the exact embezzlement charge that ended his life, Clara corrected quietly. Fabricated, deliberately months before the fire that supposedly killed us for entirely unrelated reasons. Whoever did this planned considerably further ahead than a single night's tragedy. Do you have similar discrepancies across other transactions? Rowan asked. 7 separate entries, Clara confirmed, spanning nearly a full year before the fire. Each one carefully, deliberately falsified, always attributed to my father's authority, always documented with a signature close enough to pass casual inspection, but never quite matching his actual hand. Rowan examined the signatures carefully, old suspicion hardening into growing, devastating certainty. This handwriting. I recognize the particular slant of the letter V. I've seen it in considerable correspondence over the years. Whose? Clara asked, though something in her own expression suggested she already suspected the answer, 3 years of careful investigation having led her to the same devastating conclusion. Lord Howrick Ven's, Rowan said quietly. My chief council advisor. He's served this crown for over 2 decades. That matches what I overheard, Clara said, her voice going quiet and careful, the night of the fire. 2 voices through the cellar floorboards, discussing whether the job had been done properly. One of them used the name Ven, directly, though I've never had absolute certainty it referred to Lord Howrick specifically rather than some other branch of that family. There is no other branch, Rowan said grimly. Howrick Ven is the only member of that family with any standing in this court. Clara, if he's responsible for this, he's had 7 years to consolidate exactly the kind of power that would make exposing him considerably more dangerous than it might have once been. I know, Clara said. That's precisely why I've spent 3 years being certain, rather than acting on suspicion alone. A man that deeply embedded in your council doesn't fall to accusation without absolute, undeniable proof. Rowan sat with the devastating weight of the discovery for a long moment. 7 years of trust suddenly, catastrophically reframed by evidence he understood. Examining it directly, he could no longer credibly dismiss. What do you need, he asked finally, to make this proof absolute? A confession, Clara said. Or something close enough to it that even Ven's own considerable influence couldn't talk his way past it. I've been searching these archives for exactly that. Correspondence, orders, anything that connects him directly rather than simply through circumstantial handwriting analysis. I can arrange access to his private council correspondence, Rowan said. Formally, through proper channels, without alerting him to the specific investigation. That's considerable risk, Clara said. If he notices unusual interest in his own records. I'm the king, Rowan said. Reviewing council correspondence isn't unusual, provided I'm careful about which specific records I request and how I frame the reason for requesting them. Clara studied him for a long, considering moment, understanding that his offered assistance carried genuine, considerable risk to his own political position, should Ven's influence prove as thoroughly entrenched as 7 years of careful consolidation suggested. Careful, she said finally. Considerably more careful than you're currently allowing yourself to sound, Your Majesty. This man has already orchestrated one death he successfully disguised as tragedy. He won't hesitate to arrange a second if he suspects either of us threatens what he's built. Rowan's careful investigation, conducted over the following 2 weeks with considerably more discretion than his own urgent instincts preferred, gradually uncovered a pattern of correspondence that confirmed, with growing devastating certainty, exactly the scope of Lord Howrick Ven's carefully constructed authority. He found Clara in the archive most evenings now, their careful investigative partnership having evolved, gradually, into something considerably warmer than either of them had initially permitted themselves to acknowledge. Old habits of easy conversation, of shared laughter over some absurd bureaucratic detail, resurfacing despite 7 years of hard-won distance. "You still do that thing," Rowan observed, one evening, watching her cross-reference 2 documents with the same intense, focused concentration he remembered from years earlier when she'd helped him prepare for his own first difficult counsel sessions. "What thing?" "Bite the inside of your cheek when you're concentrating. You've done it since I first met you." Clara's hand went, self-consciously, to her own jaw. "I didn't realize that was still noticeable." "Some things don't change, apparently," Rowan said, something warm and careful entering his voice, however much else genuinely has. Clara studied him for a long moment, 7 years of careful, protective distance warring against a genuine, complicated warmth she hadn't expected to feel resurfacing this thoroughly. "I thought about you," she admitted finally, quiet, "more than I probably should have, given everything at stake. I told myself for 7 years that thinking about you was a luxury I couldn't afford. That any moment of weakness might be the one that gave me away. And now?" Rowan asked carefully. "Now I'm sitting in a dusty archive with you, past midnight, cross-referencing Treasury fraud, and it feels considerably more like the life I actually wanted than any of the 7 years I spent hiding from it," Clara said, something raw and honest breaking through her usual careful composure. Rowan reached for her hand, slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. "I never stopped searching," he said quietly. "Not formally. I understand that, if I pursued anything active, whoever ordered the fire might have grown suspicious enough to finish what they'd started, wherever you were actually hiding. But privately, Clara, I never once stopped believing you might still be alive somewhere. I told myself it was foolish hope. I never managed to actually stop." "I'm sorry," Clara said, "for the 7 years you spent grieving someone who wasn't actually gone." "I'm not asking for an apology," Rowan said. "I'm asking whether there's any possibility of building something, going forward, once we've actually resolved what's currently threatening your safety. I understand that's a considerable request, given everything you've survived alone. I only want you to know it's genuinely what I'm hoping for." Clara studied him a long moment, the careful, guarded distance of 7 years gradually, cautiously giving way to something considerably warmer. "Let's survive Ven first," she said finally, something almost gentle beneath her careful practicality. "I don't think I'm ready to properly consider anything beyond that until this particular danger is genuinely, completely resolved." "That's fair," Rowan said. "Whatever pace you need, Clara. I've had 7 years of practice at patience I never actually wanted to develop. I can manage a little more." Their hands remained joined a while longer, the archive's dusty quiet settling around them with a warmth that felt, to both of them, considerably more significant than the careful investigative purpose that had originally brought them together each evening. The discovery came on the 15th evening of their careful investigation, a single piece of correspondence, buried in a routine administrative file Rowan had requested under the pretense of reviewing decade-old border security protocols that finally, devastatingly confirmed everything Clara's 3 years of careful suspicion had already established. "Look at this," Rowan said, his voice tight with controlled fury, sliding the document across the archive desk toward Clara. A payment order, dated the week before the fire, authorizing considerable funds to a private contractor for estate security consultation. Signed by Ven's own hand, no falsification attempt at all, apparently because he never expected anyone would think to connect a routine security payment to the fire that followed. Clara examined the document carefully, her chest tightening with a particular, devastating clarity of finally holding proof after 3 long years of careful, indirect suspicion. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is the confirmation." "It's evidence of payment," Rowan said, "not explicit confession." Ven could argue, plausibly, that legitimate estate security consultation has nothing inherently to do with the fire. Combined with the falsified treasury records, the handwriting analysis, my own testimony as a surviving witness, Clara said, it's considerably more than any single piece alone. I think it's enough, Your Majesty. Enough to formally act. Rowan was quiet a long moment, weighing the considerable political risk of formally moving against his own longest-serving council advisor. I'll need to convene a private council session, he said finally, presenting this evidence to the remaining trusted members before any public action. Then commands enough loyalty within certain factions that a hasty, unprepared confrontation risks genuine instability. How long will that take? Clara asked. 3 days, Rowan said. Perhaps 4, to properly prepare the presentation and ensure sufficient support among the council's uncorrupted members before I move formally. Clara nodded slowly, understanding the careful necessity of his caution, even as old instinct urged considerably faster action. Neither of them yet understood that their careful, discreet investigation had already, somewhere in the previous 15 evenings, drawn exactly the kind of attention they had worked so hard to avoid. Lord Howrick then found the missing security payment record's absence from its usual file the following morning, a small, careful discrepancy that any less thorough man might have overlooked entirely, but that 2 decades of ruthless political survival had taught him never to dismiss. He traced the missing document's recent access history within the hour, understanding with cold, calculating certainty exactly who had requested it and precisely which archive Maid had been logged, repeatedly, working unusual evening hours in the same records room. He summoned his own private investigator that same afternoon, understanding, with growing, dangerous suspicion, that whatever careful conspiracy of silence had held for 7 years now faced a genuine, unprecedented threat, one that required considerably swifter, more decisive action than his usual patient political maneuvering typically demanded. The maid, he said, the one working the archive's evening shift these past 2 weeks. I want to know everything about her. Her true name, her origins, and precisely why the king himself has apparently taken such particular interest in her. His investigator returned within the day, confirming, with growing, devastating certainty, exactly the connection Venn had feared discovering. Lord Howrick then sat alone in his private study that evening, understanding, with cold, ruthless clarity, that the woman he had believed dead 7 years earlier had apparently, impossibly, returned, and that whatever careful conspiracy he had spent 2 decades protecting now required a considerably more permanent solution than the one that had, 7 years earlier, so nearly succeeded. Clara felt the shift in the castle's atmosphere before she fully understood its cause, a subtle, careful increase in guard presence throughout the servant corridors, unfamiliar faces among the household staff that hadn't been present the previous morning, a wariness among her fellow maids that suggested word of something significant, though not yet its precise nature, had begun spreading through the castle's usual channels. She was summoned to the archive on the 17th evening by a note left in her quarters, ostensibly from Rowan, requesting her presence for what the message described as urgent, private matters concerning the investigation. Something felt wrong about the handwriting the moment she examined it more closely, some careful, practiced instinct she'd spent 7 years developing flagging a subtle inconsistency in the formal script, but by the time genuine suspicion had properly crystallized, she was already 3 corridors deep into the castle's lower levels, and the 2 men who stepped out from a shadowed alcove to block her path moved with a professional, coordinated efficiency that told her, immediately and devastatingly, exactly what kind of trap she had just walked directly into. She fought 7 years of careful, necessary self-defense training finally, desperately called upon, landing 2 solid blows before a 3rd man, appearing from behind, subdued her with practiced, brutal efficiency. She woke in a windowless chamber deep within the castle's oldest wing, wrists bound, understanding with growing, controlled fury exactly whose orders had brought her here. Lord Howrick then entered some time later, composed and elegant despite the circumstances, studying her with a particular, cold calculation of a man who had successfully eliminated one inconvenient witness 7 years earlier and fully intended to complete the job properly this time. "Clara Voss," he said, something almost admiring in his careful, measured tone. "I confess genuine surprise at your survival. My contractor assured me, 7 years ago, that the fire had been thoroughly, completely successful." "You ordered my family's murder," Clara said, keeping her voice level despite the fear building steadily in her chest, "to cover up embezzlement you fabricated and blamed on my father." "Your father's removal served this kingdom's genuine interests," Ben said, entirely unrepentant. "He opposed several trade policies my own family's considerable investments required, and his continued presence on the council threatened to unravel considerable years of careful political positioning. His death, unfortunately necessary, achieved exactly what it needed to. And my mother? My own death, that you apparently intended alongside his. Regrettable necessities," Ben said, with a coldness that made Clara's chest tighten with fresh, controlled fury. "Witnesses complicate outcomes. I've learned, across 2 decades of careful court politics, that complications are best eliminated thoroughly, the first time, rather than left to resurface later." "You won't succeed twice," Clara said. "The king knows everything, Ben. He's already preparing to formally expose you before the full council." Something flickered across Ven's composed expression, genuine calculation, rather than any particular alarm. "Then I suppose," he said, "the timeline for resolving this particular complication has grown considerably shorter than I might otherwise have preferred." He left her alone in the windowless chamber, and Clara worked, methodically and with growing, desperate urgency, at the ropes binding her wrists, understanding, with cold clarity, exactly how limited her remaining time might actually prove to be. Rowan discovered Clara's absence within the hour, his own note, a genuine one, requesting her presence for an entirely different reason, going unanswered in a way that struck him, immediately, as considerably more alarming than a simple missed meeting. "She's not in her quarters," Greta reported, genuine concern evident in her weathered features, understanding, with the particular perceptiveness of someone who managed an entire household's daily rhythms, that something had disrupted her newest maid's otherwise reliable schedule. Rowan's own investigation moved with the desperate, controlled urgency of a man who had already, once, lost this particular woman to circumstances beyond his control, and had no intention of allowing history's devastating repetition without exhausting every possible resource at his command. He found the forged note in Clara's quarters within the hour, his own trained eye immediately recognizing the subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting that Clara herself had noted, too late, with her own careful, practiced caution. "Then," he said, understanding settling into devastating, absolute certainty, "he's discovered our investigation." The search that followed, conducted with the full, urgent resources of the Crown's private guard, gradually narrowed toward the castle's oldest, least traveled wing, a section of the fortress that Ben's own decades of court service had granted him considerable, unusual familiarity with, familiarity Rowan understood, with growing dread, could easily conceal exactly the kind of hidden chamber their search now desperately required. They found the windowless room an hour before dawn, 2 of Ven's own private guards positioned outside its heavy door, overwhelmed within minutes by Rowan's considerably superior force. Clara stood inside, wrists finally, freshly worked free of their bindings, her expression fierce and unbroken despite the ordeal. "You're all right," Rowan said, relief overwhelming every careful, controlled composure he'd maintained throughout the desperate search. "I'm all right," Clara confirmed, crossing to him with a directness that carried none of the careful, guarded distance she'd once maintained. Ven's already fled the immediate area, I suspect. He understood, before he left, that time had grown considerably shorter than he'd hoped. Rowan's fury hardened into cold, absolute resolve. Then we ensure he doesn't get considerably further. The formal confrontation, when it came, unfolded before the full assembled council within the day, Rowan having summoned every remaining trusted member of his court, understanding that whatever came next required considerably more transparency than careful, private maneuvering could any longer properly provide. 7 years ago, Rowan addressed the assembled nobility, Clara standing beside him rather than concealed behind careful protective distance. This court was told that Lord Corwin Voss embezzled considerable funds from this crown's treasury, and that his family perished in an accidental fire. Both claims were lies, deliberately constructed by a man this council has trusted for over 2 decades. Murmurs swept through the assembled court, several members' gazes shifting immediately toward Lord Howrick Ven's empty customary seat. Clara Voss, Rowan continued, gesturing toward her directly, survived that fire. She has spent 7 years hiding from the man responsible, gathering, patiently, and at considerable personal risk, exactly the evidence this council requires to understand the truth. This is Clara Voss, several nobles repeated, recognition dawning across considerable faces as they studied her more directly than court protocol typically permitted. She is, Rowan confirmed, something fierce and unwavering entering his voice. And I want this entire court to understand clearly, she's not simply a survivor whose family this crown owes justice. She is the woman I loved 7 years ago, and the woman I intend to spend whatever years remain of my reign properly, honestly earning the right to love again, should she genuinely wish it. The declaration, delivered with absolute royal authority before the full assembled court, drew audible, considerable gasps from several nobles unaccustomed to such direct, unguarded personal admission from their usually composed, controlled king. Lord Howrick Ven, Rowan continued, his voice hardening into formal, unwavering judgment, stands accused of treason, fraud, and the orchestrated murder of Lord Corwin Voss and the attempted murder of his family. I want every available guard mobilized to locate him immediately. He will face this court's full judgment for what he's done. Ven's flight from the castle proved considerably shorter-lived than his 2 decades of careful political survival might have suggested. His own extensive network of loyal contacts, cultivated across years of patient consolidation, proving insufficient against a king now moving with the full, decisive weight of confirmed evidence and considerable, mobilized resources. Guards located him within 3 days, attempting to cross the kingdom's southern border under a false identity, and brought him back to the capital in formal chains for a trial Rowan insisted remain entirely, transparently public. You'll want to hear his defense, Elder Havermore, one of the council's few genuinely uncorrupted members, told Rowan the evening before the formal proceedings, before you decide the exact severity of whatever judgment you intend to deliver. His defense doesn't interest me, Rowan said. The evidence is absolute, Havermore. Falsified financial records, the security payment matching the fire's exact timeline, Clara's own testimony as a surviving witness. Nonetheless, Havermore said carefully, proper judicial process serves this kingdom's genuine long-term stability considerably better than however satisfying immediate, decisive punishment might feel. Rowan understood the wisdom in that particular counsel, however difficult it proved to properly embrace given 7 years of accumulated grief, now finally, catastrophically resolved. The formal trial proceeded 3 days later, before the full assembled court, Ven himself offering no genuine denial once confronted with the accumulated weight of evidence. Falsified ledgers, the security payment record, Clara's own detailed, devastating testimony, regarding the voices she'd overheard through her family estate's cellar floorboards 7 years earlier. "I acted," Ben said, when finally permitted formal statement, "in service of what I genuinely believed represented this kingdom's practical interests." Lord Voss's opposition to certain trade policies threatened considerable economic stability. "I don't regret the calculation, whatever this court's judgment ultimately determines." "You murdered an innocent family," Rowan said, "and let an entire kingdom believe a devastating lie for 7 years, to protect your own considerable personal wealth and political standing. This court has no genuine interest in your calculated justifications." The formal sentence, delivered following the court's brief deliberation, confirmed permanent exile beyond Ashgrove's borders, alongside the complete confiscation of Ven's considerable accumulated wealth and formal stripping of every title he'd once held, a punishment Rowan had specifically requested over several council members' initial, harsher recommendations for execution, understanding, even through his own considerable fury, that permanent, humiliating exile served the kingdom's genuine public accounting of the truth considerably more meaningfully than the swift, private mercy execution might otherwise have provided. Clara watched the sentence delivered with a complicated mixture of hard-won relief and old, permanent grief for a family she could never genuinely reclaim, her father's name formally restored, her mother's memory finally, publicly honored, 7 years of careful, isolated hiding at last, genuinely resolved. "It's over," Rowan said, finding her afterward in the same quiet garden courtyard where they'd first cautiously begun rebuilding whatever remained possible between them. "Part of it," Clara said, echoing, without quite realizing it, the same careful acknowledgement another woman, in another kingdom entirely, might have offered a king facing similar, hard-won resolution. "My family's name is restored. Ven's finally, properly accounted for. But the 7 years themselves, they don't simply disappear because justice has finally arrived." "I know," Rowan said. "I don't expect them to. I only hope, genuinely, that we might still find our way toward building something worth having, going forward, however long that particular reconstruction requires." Clara Voss's formal restoration to her rightful noble standing took place 3 weeks after Ven's exile, a considerably smaller, more intimate ceremony than the elaborate public spectacle several council members had initially proposed, Clara herself insisting on exactly the kind of quiet, deliberate dignity that 7 years of forced anonymity had taught her to genuinely value over grand public theater. She did not immediately accept Rowan's careful, patient offer of renewed courtship, understanding, with hard-won clarity, that 7 years of necessary hiding had reshaped her into someone considerably different from the laughing 19-year-old who had once fallen so completely, so uncomplicatedly in love with him. "I need time," she told him, standing together in the same archive room where their careful investigation had first cautiously rebuilt something between them, "to understand who I've actually become, separate from whoever I might have been becoming with you, before everything happened." "Take whatever time you need," Rowan said, understanding, from considerable hard-won patience, exactly what genuine respect for her own careful, deliberate pace actually required. "I'm not asking you to become Luna, Clara. I'm not asking you to become anyone's wife at all, if that's not genuinely what you want. I'm simply asking for the chance to know whoever you've actually become, and to see whether there's still something worth building between us, freely and honestly, rather than assuming 7-year-old love automatically restores itself." Clara studied him for a long, considering moment, old grief and genuine, cautious hope moving together behind her careful composure. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like that.
Properly this time."
Slowly, and on my own genuine terms. The months that followed brought Clara through a careful, deliberate process of rebuilding, not simply her relationship with Rowan, though that too developed with patient, unhurried care, but her own genuine sense of who she wanted to become, now that 7 years of necessary survival no longer demanded every waking decision. She established, eventually, a formal role within the Crown's own treasury oversight, understanding from painful, personal experience exactly how devastating falsified financial records could prove when left unexamined, and determined to ensure no future family suffered her own family's fate through similar, unchecked corruption. Rowan never pressed her toward anything beyond her own genuine readiness, understanding, from 7 devastating years of grief he now carried considerably more honestly, exactly what patient, earned trust actually required. Not grand gestures, not desperate hope, simply consistent, honest presence, offered without expectation of reward. It was Clara herself, nearly a year after Ven's formal exile, who finally, genuinely closed the distance between them, finding Rowan alone in the same garden courtyard on a quiet evening, reaching for his hand with the same easy, uncomplicated warmth she'd once, 7 years earlier, extended without any careful hesitation at all. "I think," she said, "I'm finally ready. Not because 7 years have simply erased themselves, but because I've had genuine time to understand who I actually am now, and I've decided, deliberately and freely, that who I am now still wants this. Wants you." Rowan felt something in his chest, carefully guarded for 8 combined years of grief and patient reconstruction, finally, completely settle into peace. "I would want nothing more," he said, "than whatever future you're genuinely ready to build, at exactly the pace that feels honestly yours." She had entered his castle pretending to be invisible, certain that 7 years of careful hiding had erased every trace of the woman he'd once loved. He had recognized her instantly, understanding, watching her rebuild herself into someone genuinely her own across the following year, that some things genuine love, chief among them, never actually required perfect memory to survive. They simply required, in the end, the patient courage to finally, honestly choose each other again. The end.